About 20 years ago, I heard a sermon that shocked me. The main point of the sermon, as I remember it, could be summarized like this. God did not save us because He loved us. He saved us because He wishes to display His glory. Salvation is not about us, it's about God. God's primary motivation in redemption is not some sentimental love for humanity. If that were the case, He would have saved everyone, but He hasn't. God's primary motivation in redemption is not some sentimental love for humanity. It is a fierce jealousy for His own glory. Now, I liked this preacher, and I believe that he was honestly just trying to faithfully teach the Word of God. But I do believe that he was seriously mistaken here. God does not save us because He loves us. He saves us because He wishes to display His glory. That statement betrays a fundamental misunderstanding about God's glory. Now, the text I want to look at this morning is perhaps the most famous passage in all of human literature. You probably don't even need to open your Bibles. You can probably recite it from memory. John 3:14-17. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in Him may not perish but have everlasting life. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God did not send His Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through Him might be saved. Now, this morning I want to draw your attention to three words in that passage. The first word is the word hutos. That's the Greek word that's translated so in the line, for God so loved the world. Now, to English speakers, that familiar translation, for God so loved the world, suggests that God loved the world so much. He loved the world to such an extravagant degree that He gave His only begotten Son. But in recent years, many biblical scholars have challenged this popular interpretation of John 3:16. According to these scholars, the Greek word hutos indicates manner, not extent. In other words, John 3:16 does not mean God loved the world so much. It means God loved the world in this way. So, for example, here is how the verse is rendered in the New English translation, the Net Bible. For this is the way God loved the world, He gave His one and only Son. And the Holman Christian Standard Bible gives a very similar translation. For God loved the world in this way, He gave His one and only Son. Now, this new translation of John 3:16 may not change the fundamental message of the verse, but it does seem to change the emphasis. God loved the world in this way. To me, that just doesn't have the same emotional intensity as the translation that I learned as a child. God so loved the world. But in my opinion, recent research into this matter has decisively vindicated the traditional understanding of John 3:16. I won't bore you with the details here, but in 2019, a scholar named Aaron Jensen published a very thorough study of the particular Greek construction that we find here in John 3:16. And Jensen showed that in this particular construction, the word hutos does indeed indicate the extent or the intensity of love, precisely as the traditional English translation suggests. For God so loved the world. God loved the world so much. God loved the world to such an extravagant degree. Now, the second word I want to draw your attention to is the word world. The object of God's extravagant love is the world. Now, obviously, the world includes humanity as a whole. The world is not simply a reference to the elect, to some subset within humanity. And if there's any doubt on that point, it's completely removed by what Jesus said later in John chapter 12. So in verse 47 of John 12, Jesus says, "If anyone hears my words and does not keep them, I do not judge him, for I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world." So here Jesus specifies that the world that he's not come to judge includes everyone, even those who ultimately do not keep his words and are not saved. If anyone hears my words and does not keep them, I do not judge him. Why? For I did not come to judge the world. So there's just no way to escape the conclusion that God sent his Son to the cross because of his extravagant love for everyone, for the entire human race. Now, the final word I want to draw your attention to is the verb hupsao. This is the Greek verb which is translated lifted up in John 3:14. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Now, this Greek verb has both a literal and a figurative meaning. It can be used literally to describe something that is raised into the air, that is lifted up into the air. But it can also be used figuratively to describe someone being exalted or raised to a high position. Now, everywhere else in the New Testament that this verb is used, it's used in that figurative sense. It's translated exalted. But here in John's Gospel, the word is used repeatedly to describe the crucifixion. And this seems to be a deliberate play on words. And moreover, it's a play on words that's tied to one of the central themes in John's Gospel, the glorification of Jesus. And if you think back to the famous prologue of John's Gospel in John chapter 1, in verse 14, John writes, "We beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth." And then the rest of the book is structured around the revealing of God's glory. So remember, the story begins in chapter 2 with Jesus turning the water to wine. And that episode concludes with the words, Jesus did this first sign and revealed his glory. And so after that first sign, there's a series of additional signs in the first 11 chapters of John's Gospel that culminate in Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. But as remarkable as this story is, where Jesus dramatically calls Lazarus out of the grave, this is not actually the climax of John's Gospel. The first 11 chapters of John's Gospel turn out to be merely a prelude to the glorification of Jesus. It's not until chapter 12 that Jesus says the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. That's chapter 12, verse 23. And it's clear that Jesus is talking about the hour of his crucifixion, because he goes on to say a few verses later, "Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I have come into the world. I've come to this hour. Father, glorify your name." So, and then the next chapter, John chapter 13, we have Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples. And if you remember, in John 13, it's at the moment that Judas leaves the upper room to go betray Jesus that Jesus says, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him." In other words, Jesus is saying, the hour has begun. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified, and it's happening now. It's starting now. Okay, but how is Jesus glorified in the crucifixion? Is it just that the crucifixion is a necessary prelude to the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus? Well, the resurrection and the ascension is certainly part of the glorification of Jesus in the Gospel of John, but John seems to present the crucifixion itself as being part of that glorification. Remember the verb hupsao, lift up. Again, in John's Gospel, the crucifixion is repeatedly described with the verb hupsao, lift up, and it seems to be an intentional wordplay. Of course, the crucifixion is the moment in which Jesus is literally lifted up into the air on the cross, but it's also the time in John's Gospel when Jesus is exalted or glorified. Now, it's hard for us in the modern world to fully appreciate just how shocking that wordplay is. For us, the cross is a religious symbol. It's even a piece of jewelry. But of course, in the ancient world, the cross was a symbol of torture and degradation. Crucifixion was not only excruciatingly painful, it was also intensely shameful. The victim of crucifixion became a billboard for Roman power. Rome didn't just kill a rebel, they strung up his body on a cross to show everyone that this person was a loser and they were in control. So how can the Gospel of John associate the crucifixion with the glorification of Jesus? Well, remember back in Exodus 33 and 34, that a story where Moses asked God, "Show me your glory." And remember, God does show his glory to Moses. He hides Moses in the cleft of the rock and passes by so that Moses catches a glimpse of God's glory. But what did that display of God's glory actually involve? Did Moses see a fireworks show? Did he see bright lights? Well, what we read in the text is this. This is from Exodus 34, verse 6. Yahweh passed before Moses and proclaimed, "Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and thankfulness." The display of God's glory on Mount Sinai involved the proclamation of God's character. That unprecedented revelation of God's glory, which Moses experienced there on Mount Sinai, was the proclamation of God's character. God revealed his glory to Moses by revealing that he was merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. So now I think we can understand why John can describe the hour of Jesus' crucifixion as the hour in which he was glorified. When we look at the cross, we see more clearly than ever before that God is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. God's glory is more visible on Mount Calvary than it was even on Mount Sinai. The sinner who stands at the foot of the cross has seen God's glory with a clarity that surpasses even what Moses experienced there in the cleft of the rock on Mount Sinai. So in closing, I want to return again to that sermon that I heard 20 years ago. Remember the preacher's conclusion: God does not save us because he loves us. He saves us because he wishes to display his glory. No. God loving us is God displaying his glory. The author Harriet Beecher Stowe got it precisely right in her famous novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. If you've read that book, you might remember that the story of Tom ends with these words: "Not in the riches of omnipotence is the chief glory of God, but in self-denying, suffering love." Jesus displayed God's glory in John chapter 2 when he turned water into wine. Jesus displayed God's glory in John chapter 5 when he healed the paralytic. He displayed God's glory in chapter 6 when he fed 5,000 people with one boy's lunch. He displayed God's glory in chapter 8 when he healed a blind man who had been blind from birth. He displayed God's glory in chapter 11 when he called Lazarus out of the grave. But all of these displays, as wonderful as they are, they pale in comparison to that last display. Jesus displayed God's glory when he hung naked and broken on a cross. Jesus displayed God's glory when he showed us that God is love. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. So as we go through this week, as we go about our task today and for the rest of the week, may we not forget that one simple but inexpressibly profound truth that's at the heart of the gospel. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. May we allow that truth to continue to transform our thinking and renew our minds.